Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett.
No, you're not. You're Preston. I'm excited to introduce Colby Townsend. He's a PhD candidate going to Indiana University this fall, and we're going to talk about his award-winning thesis in our next conversation. So we'll cover the documentary hypothesis, and we'll think of this as kind of an introduction to that theory about how the Old Testament was put together. So we're going to discuss a lot of biblical terms. Some of them you may be familiar with, some of them you'll get more up to speed, and it'll be a really fun conversation. You don't want to miss it. Before we get to that, I just wanted to mention one more thing. As you know, Gospel Tangents has teamed up with the Dialogue Podcast Network. We can now be heard on lyceum.fm. That's lyceum.fm. So you can hear all your favorite podcasts, such as the Dialogue Podcast Network, Gospel Tangents, Beyond the Block, and Mormon News Report. So if you want to hear all of us, and we release every few days, so you'll get a lot of updates. So go to lyceum.fm and subscribe there. Now back to our conversation. All right, well, welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited. I have an award-winning scholar. Could you go ahead and tell us who you are?
Yeah, I'm Colby Townsend. I have degrees in comparative literature, religious studies, and history from both the University of Utah and the Utah State University.
Oh, an Aggie and a Ute. Nice.
Yes, yeah, and I'll be heading out to Indiana to go to IU Bloomington in just a couple weeks.
Now, is that the same as the Hoosiers there? Bobby Knight and all that?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I'm still learning about the university, but yeah, Hoosiers.
It's the Big Ten school.
Yeah,
yeah, it's in Bloomington. Well, yeah. Awesome.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're keeping the red here, so Indiana's also red.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, hop from red to blue to red. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. I did mention that you were an award-winning scholar. You just won an award at the Mormon History Association. Tell us about that.
Right. Yeah. So they have it in alternating years. So one year they'll have the best thesis award, so master's thesis, and the next year they'll have the best dissertation award. So for a PhD. So this year my master's thesis from USU was awarded.
All right. And so what was the name of your article?
Yeah, the thesis title is a little bit long, but it's Rewriting Eden with the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith and Genesis 1. Joseph Smith and the reception of Genesis 1 through 6 in early America.
Yeah. So it's a fantastic thing. You know, I love, because when we talked about, what are we going to talk about today? I said, well, I want to talk about the documentary hypothesis because I know you've corrected a few things. I talked about it with David Patrick, and Benjamin Schaefer a couple of months ago, and I didn't get it right. So we're going to get it right today.
Yeah. No.
And but I didn't realize until I read your article that it really ties into your award-winning thesis. So this is fantastic. So soon, in another 4 years or so, we'll be calling you Dr. Townsend, right?
Yeah, maybe 6. We'll
6?
see.
Oh, boy. These things are long.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. So, well, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about that then, because first of all, and I'm going to tell you this, I love to talk to regular people and say, have you ever heard the documentary hypothesis? And I always say, no, what's that?
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, I know in the scholarly world, everybody knows what that is. But for, a lot of my listeners are we're not scholars. And so we talk to people like you because you're the experts. And so can you give us a little bit of background? What is the documentary hypothesis? And then we'll talk about your paper that talks about how it relates to the Book of Mormon. So that's going to be really interesting. So,
definitely.
So tell us about the documentary hypothesis.
Okay, yeah. So first off, you didn't get everything wrong. So I don't want to give that impression of what you're doing. We just chatted afterward, I think. I think you had made a post in Mormon Historians or some other Facebook group.
He rewrote it for me because he was a nice guy. I was like, well, tell me what to write. I don't know what to write.
So I just wanted to help. But yeah, so sometimes so there are a handful of different terms that different people will be slightly familiar with. If they're not too familiar with the documentary hypothesis right at the beginning, sort of like I think Ben Schaefer didn't know exactly what that was until you described it. He was familiar with the term textual criticism, right? But then what he was talking about wasn't textual criticism either. So it's kind of funny, like all these different
Well, and please,
terms,
I would love to get introduced into what is textual criticism and all these other terms that a lot of us kind of are familiar with them, but we don't really understand.
And they're so niche and they're so specific that it's understandable that that the nuances of each of the different things are not going to necessarily get caught. So a lot of the time people are going to be talking about historical criticism. So when were texts written? Who were they written by? Those kinds of things, the methods and the tools that scholars use to be able to identify that kind of information. That's historical criticism. So sometimes, and I'm trying to remember exactly what it was in your post, but sometimes people will use documentary hypothesis as an interchangeable phrase with historical criticism if we're trying to understand different parts of the, like when was a text X written in the Hebrew Bible. It's important because a lot of people will be familiar, probably even more so, with the phrase higher criticism. The purpose for that phrase and the reason that it came about was that there was lower criticism and higher criticism. Lower criticism was the study of languages, so philology, the way that Northwest Semitic languages all kind of relate to each other. Part of the lower criticism is also textual criticism. Textual criticism itself is finding all of the different manuscripts of a single given text. So if we wanted to engage with the textual criticism of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, we would gather together all of the manuscripts from Qumran, from the medieval, as far as back as we could go, which before Qumran, the oldest manuscripts for the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible that we had only went back to about 1000 CE.
So Qumran, probably a better word that most people would be
Dead Sea Scrolls.
Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes, thank you. Yes. So, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, it shifted us back more than 1,000 years in history as far as the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible goes, because we didn't have any complete Hebrew manuscripts of the individual books of the Hebrew Bible that dated really very much further back from that.
So before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in, what was that, the 40s, 1940s?
48, winter of 47,
What were
48.
the oldest manuscripts that we had? And then
of the Hebrew Bible.
Right. Hebrew Bible meaning the first 5 books of Moses, or does it include
Hebrew Bible is interchangeable in Mormonism with Old Testament.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the Pentateuch, let me make sure we got all these. Because the Pentateuch would be the first 5 books of Moses.
Yep. Penta is 5. Tuch,
and then Torah would be the Old Testament.
Torah is also the first 5.
Oh, so Torah and Pentateuch are interchangeable.
Yeah. The Pentateuch is just is more of a scholarly term.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. So if you're coming at it from Judaism, the Hebrew Bible is the full Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why I think it's important to call it the Hebrew Bible is that the Old Testament is in a completely different order, and it's for theological reasons. Malachi, at the very end of the book of Malachi, leads into Matthew with the prophecy of the messenger.
King James Version.
Yep. Yeah. So that's significant. The way that the books are arranged, you read them a specific way. So in the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, if we use a phrase more common within Judaism, the Tanakh, it stands for Torah, so ta, nach. The end part is the Nevi'im, the prophets. So you have 3 different parts of the Hebrew Bible. You have the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. And the Ketuvim are the writings. And there are some significant differences when you separate it that way. I think for the most part, probably most Christian readers of the Old Testament would expect Daniel to be included in the prophets, but he's actually at the end of the writings. He's not in the prophets. And Daniel was historically the last written text of the Hebrew Bible. You have those kinds of differences, but you're also not going to be reading the end of Malachi as if it's leading into, the Gospels.
Because there's about a 400-year gap between Malachi and Matthew, is that about
somewhere
right?
around there, yeah. Most scholars date Malachi to somewhere around 450 BCE or so. And I actually wrote a paper on that as well, on Malachi and the Book of Mormon.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, you can see all of the different
We'll post
things
links
in there.
or I'll make sure I get those
Yeah,
from you.
sounds good.
So, all right. So you said Daniel was the last book written. What approximately when was that? So that was after Malachi, then.
Well after, yeah. That was written around 165 BCE, give or take.
I didn't realize
a couple
that.
of years. Yeah.
Oh, so that's what really should be the last one. If we're going chronologically.
Yeah, if you were going chronologically, yeah.
Interesting.
Yep.
Okay, so Tanakh. So Ta is the Torah, Nach is
Na
thank you.
is the Nevi'im.
Nevi'im as in the prophets. So that would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, those kinds of people.
Yep.
And then what was the last one?
Ketuvim.
Yeah. Those are the
writings.
The writings. So that would include Psalms, Proverbs, Daniel apparently.
Yeah, Esther, Shir Hashirim, so the Songs of Solomon.
Okay.
I always say Song of Songs because that's what Shir Hashirim means, but Song of Solomon I think is what it's called in the King James. Yeah.
Which didn't Joseph Smith say that was the least inspired?
That's one of the fascinating things. I bring this up probably too often. It's pretty much whenever anybody brings it up in these kinds of conversations that it's in the JST, the Joseph Smith's Bible Revision Project. It's in the manuscripts, but he kept citing it. He kept using language from the Songs of Solomon throughout the rest of his life. So he kept using it in his preaching, as if it was still an inspired text. So, yeah.
Well, interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that's really good to kind of get the three breaks in the Old Testament in there. So the documentary hypothesis refers primarily to the Pentateuch or the Torah.
Right. Only
the first 5 books.
Yep. Yeah.
So pretend that everybody is dumb and we don't know what this is. How would you describe the documentary hypothesis?
Yeah, I wouldn't expect anyone to actually really know unless they got interested in this before. So essentially, at the turn of the 17th century and toward the end of the 18th, throughout that whole century, scholars were kind of obsessed with trying to figure out all the contradictions within the Torah. So, it was
contradictions in the Bible. There's no problems in the Bible.
Yeah,
what?
It's inerrant, so we're all good. But Baruch Spinoza and a handful of other scholars toward the end of the 17th century had written a handful, and this is what I go over mostly in the first chapter in my thesis.
Paper, yes.
Yeah, they had. For Spinoza particularly, he and a handful of others wanted to see a shift away from a theological grounding in public law. So he was in the Dutch Republic, and at the time leading up to his life, there were a handful of ecclesiastical leaders that were trying to influence public law so that it would be biblically based. And so Spinoza's project in his theological political treatise was to essentially show that you can't rely on the text of the Bible. There are too many contradictions and a handful of other things that by itself make it too difficult to implement because what is correct? There are multiple things in the text itself. But then he and a handful of others were really trying to undercut biblical authority so that these ecclesiastical leaders wouldn't be able to implement their own versions of biblical law into society. And he and a handful of others were dramatically successful. Generally, up until a few years ago, scholars have approached the Enlightenment as a shift away from religion and the Bible. But a handful of scholars, literally in the last 10 years, have shown that actually the 17th and the 18th centuries were really biblical centuries. It's difficult to go a page or two in any writings at that period, any of the major writings, and not see multiple citations of the Bible, or at least allusions or echoes of biblical phrases. So up to that point, it was there weren't really very many scholars like publicly saying, and there weren't really biblical scholars proper saying those kinds of things. If you go back to the Renaissance at the beginning of the 16th century, there were a handful of scholars that were using textual criticism to understand what would later become historical criticism, trying to understand when things were actually written and who the author might have been. We can get a general idea of that kind of thing. And so toward the end of the 18th century was when you started to see the shift toward what we would now call the documentary hypothesis. There was a physician named Jean Astruc. He was French. He wasn't a biblical scholar by any means, but he was worried about the scholarship of guys like Spinoza and others. And so he tried to essentially appropriate the scholarship that they had written and created and the data that they had been able to pull from the text of the Pentateuch. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 34, at the end of Deuteronomy, how could Moses have written about his own death?
Yeah,
right.
And I think that's the easiest thing for most people, because if we believe that, and certainly there are biblical literates who believe this.
Yeah.
How can Moses write about his own death?
Yeah, right. And it's fun because you have millennia of explanations for some of these kinds of things, and thousands of readers. And so one of the fun explanations was, and this was a rabbinic explanation,
yes,
that Moses wrote about that with tears.
I've seen that. And there was a
yeah.
old TV show. I don't know if you ever saw it, Mysteries of the Bible.
No.
But they had an Orthodox rabbi, and that was the explanation, that Moses literally wrote, Moses died with tears in his eyes because he knew he was going to die when he wrote it.
Yep, and he wasn't going to get to see the land.
Right.
He never got to fulfill the promise.
Yeah, and
so,
like, I mean, I don't know how you can believe that, but there are people that really...
Yeah, well, and that's the kind of thing that, not only Spinoza and Jean Astruc and a few others, but that's the kind of pushback that biblical scholars have gotten, because really there isn't a contradiction in the Bible. The contradiction is with you. You just have to figure out a way to explain what you think is a contradiction.
And I love it, especially here in the Mormon world. They always talk about, these apologists, you just can't believe them. But there are apologists, there are Jewish apologists, there are Christian apologists. I mean, I got to tell you, I think that's a pretty big stretch to say that Moses was crying as he wrote, and Moses died.
Right. Yeah, well, historically it's a little bit difficult because you have to make up a scenario.
Yeah.
But as if you're in a devotional setting, and that's a part of the the traditional explanation, and it's within the Talmud, then, it's kind of a fun little side story. But historically speaking, that's really difficult because there are also turns of phrases throughout the Torah where the author will say something like, the Canaanites were then in the land. So for the reader, it's sort of like, wait, the Canaanites were then in the land, so the author is aware that later they weren't in the land? Interesting. Okay, that wouldn't have happened, until later. And I think it's in Deuteronomy 1 also where you get the description of the Israelites being on the other side of the river. So which wouldn't have happened until after Moses had died and the Israelites came over. So, there are just tons of those all throughout the text. You also get a handful of passages like with the sale of Joseph, and this is where you'd have fun with David Bokovoy.
I need to get him on.
Yeah.
You'll have to put in a good word for me.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we'll have to chat with him. But the sale of Joseph, he's better known as Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. When his brothers try to sell him, the story actually has two different people that his brothers are selling him to, two different groups. So there are a handful of places in the text like that where it's really from a close reading and a careful attention to detail. The Torah is an unreadable text if you're really taking it step by step as a readable text.
As far as a
literary, just a narrative reading. If you're just reading the narrative and taking seriously the information that it's giving you, and you're sort of compiling that information as you go, it's unreadable. who sold Joseph? Like, or who was Joseph sold to? Was he actually sold? Well, like it's those kinds of questions, you know, as you're going through and doing a close reading of the Torah that start to get problematic in the 17th, but then especially the 18th century.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Colby Townsend. In our next conversation, we're going to try to date the book of Deuteronomy. Does it date to the time of Moses in approximately 1200 BC?
Deuteronomy definitely was not written before Josiah, but it could have been written pretty much, you know, for a few hundred years after that. So scholars right now are sort of engaging with, okay, from Josiah to when could it have been written? When was the last period?
So there's a big range on Deuteronomy. So 640 is the earliest?
640 would be the 620. So somewhere around in there would be the earliest. But you could only go down so far.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents. And for just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview without any interruption. If you'd like a paperback version of our transcripts, go to Amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview. Also, if you'd like to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website, and I'll be able to send you a transcript as soon as they are completed, and click the subscribe button. You can also find our latest information on Facebook.com/GospelTangents, as well as we're on Twitter @GospelTangents. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The link is at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, and you can subscribe there. Also, please give us a 5-star review. If you want to support all of the podcasts as part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, go to lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, and do a search for Dialogue Podcast Network or Gospel Tangents, because, you know, that's a pretty cool one too. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.